I'm Richard Taylor from the Philosophy Department at Marquette University and visiting professor at the Catholic University of Leuven. Together with my colleague, Professor Andrea Robilio, we present you these lectures on Thomas Aquinas, on the nature and attainment of happiness for our fall 2014 class at Marquette and KU Leuven. Class number 11 is on Aquinas, on ultimate happiness in the Summa Contra Gentiles. This particular video, the second, 11b, second for the class, contains remarks on selected teachings of Aquinas on ultimate happiness or felicity in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3. So we're going to look at selected teachings for this, and I will explicate a bit, calling attention to certain principles that are involved in those teachings. First of all, let's look at what he says in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 1. There he says the following: that there is one first being possessing the full perfection of the whole of being, and that we call him God, has been shown in the preceding books. So Aquinas is making it clear that he's drawing upon work that he did in preceding books for what he's now going to do in Book 3. From the abundance of his perfection, he endows all existing things with being, so that he is fully established not only as the first being, but also as the original source of all existing things. This is key for Aquinas' argument in this particular book. So that's been established. He goes on, moreover, he, God, has granted being to other things, not by a necessity of his nature. And the issue in the mind of Aquinas here is that Avicenna had said that there was a certain, in Aquinas' interpretation, things emanate from God by a certain necessity of nature. So that's who he has in mind. So I go back then. Moreover, he has granted being to other things not by a necessity of his nature, but according to the choice of his will, as has been made clear in our earlier explanations. So he's going to draw upon that earlier material. He's being very clear about that. From this it follows that he is the Lord of all things that he has made. Now, be careful of what he's doing here. Pay attention. He's the Lord of it, and so he will give commands to it, and he has intentions with regard to it. Aquinas is giving you a hint as to what's coming. From this it follows that he is Lord of the things that he has made, for we are masters of the things that are subject to our will. So God has used his own will to create things and is Lord over those things. Aquinas continues then. In fact, he holds perfect dominion over things produced by himself, since to produce them he is in need neither of the assistance of an external agent, the reference here is to Avicenna, nor of the underlying presence of matter, for he is the universal maker of the whole of being. Close quote. Now that reference to Avicenna was reference to the need to create through intermediaries in order to retain divine simplicity, as Avicenna saw it. Aquinas doesn't agree in that matter. But let's continue. I think he's given us fair warning here as to how he's going to develop his arguments in Book 3, and those arguments will be based on what has already been established by Aquinas in Books 1 and 2. In Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1, then, it was established that God exists as the fullness of the perfection of being, and that God is the cause of the being of all things. Further, the nature of God is intellect, and so God is a rational agent who acts by will. In Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 2, the topic is creation, and God there is established as the creator of all that exists. And in this way, God is the creator through his own act and not through any intermediary for the act of creation or the giving of being to something. That is key for the argument of Aquinas. These notions then are presupposed in Aquinas' account of ultimate felicity in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3. Now, note the following. God alone is the creator. God as sole creator acts by intellect and by will, and so acts for an end, not randomly. God does not act by necessity of nature of will. Necessity of nature of intellect, but acts by will. In doing so, when God creates, things are purposefully created with natural ends. With this established, then, it's necessary that all things have ends and that there be a reditio, a return to their cause, as we saw earlier in the previous video. Hence, it's not surprising if we see Aquinas write the following, quote, "Now each of the things produced through the will of an agent is directed to an end by the agent." He's drawing out the conceptual consequences for the meaning of agent and willing agent. For the proper object of the will is the good and the end. As a result, things which proceed from will must be directed to some end. It's extraordinary that right here he's just slowly drawing this out, and yet the consequences are very clear for the entire discussion in Book 3. He goes on, "Moreover, each thing achieves its ultimate end through its own action, must be directed to the end by him who gives things the principles through which they act." Close quote. So if they act in virtue of their end, and they have been given that end, then God has provided that end, and God provides the end. And of course, if God provides the end intentionally, and they come from God, then according to the principles that we talked about with regard to reditio, they must return to God, and that return is their ultimate fulfillment. But the notion of the return, or the reditio, varies with regard to the nature of the thing involved. If the thing that is returning is intellectual, then it must, according to Aquinas, as we will see him develop, it must return in an intellectual way to the presence of God and to see God, because that is the complete intellectual fulfillment of an entity which is an intellectual entity. But let's go on. So, and he also writes, "So it must be that God, who is in all ways perfect in himself, and who endows all things with being from his own power, exists as the ruler of all beings and is ruled by none other. Nor is there anything that escapes his rule, just as there is nothing that does not receive its being from him. As he is perfect in being and causing, so he is perfect in ruling." So the complete setup is really right here for everything that Aquinas is going to later develop. But let's continue. In Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 2, Aquinas further elaborates on the nature, the nature of acting for an end, which is necessarily the case for all created things. The end is not something unachievable and infinite, according to Aquinas, but rather something attainable in virtue of the intentional creation by the Creator. The Creator, it would not be rational for the Creator to install in something an end which is unachievable and infinite, and can never be attained, because it gives an end to all things, and certainly that would not be consonant with divine goodness. So Aquinas is constructing his view here out of what he has already established. Distinguishing natural agents and those which act by intellect, Aquinas writes the following, quote, For every agent, the principle of its action is either its nature or its intellect. Now, there is no question that intellectual agents act for the sake of an end, because, of course, all things act for the sake of an end, because they think ahead of time in their intellects of the things which they achieve through action. And they think of them, and then they're going to will them, right? So, and their action stems from such preconception. That is something that thinks ahead of time of its action. Its action is not random or immediately spontaneous in some way, but it's intended action, willed action. He goes on, this is what it means for intellect to be the principle of action. And continuing that passage, he writes, just as the entire likeness of the result achieved by the actions of an intelligent agent exists in the intellect that preconceives it, so we preconceive what we're going to do, we know what the a likeness of it is in us, and then we do the action. So just as the entire likeness of the result achieved by the actions of an intelligent agent exists in the intellect that preconceives it, so too does the likeness of a natural resultant pre-exist in the natural agent. So this is in natural agents and also in intellectual agents. He goes on. And as a consequence of this, the action is determined to a definite result, because the thing has an end within it and has a definite result. For fire gives rise to fire and an olive to an olive. Therefore, the agent acts with nature as its principle. The agent that acts with nature as its principle is just as much directed to a definite end in its action as is the agent that acts through intellect as its principle. Therefore, every agent acts for an end. Now, the foundation of the reasoning for this is found in the nature of creation, in the way God creates things. And God creates things by will and with intention. So he's building on his earlier argumentation. Now, given the nature of divine goodness, the Creator originated all things such that agents act for a good. How could it be otherwise? In the case of the human intellect, he writes the following. Quote, an intelligent agent acts for the sake of an end, in the sense that it determines the end for itself. It determines for itself the end it will pursue. On the other hand, an agent that acts from a natural impulse, though acting, again, for an end, as we showed in the preceding chapter, does not determine the end for itself. It doesn't reflect and determine the end for itself because it doesn't have intellect. Since it does not know the meaning of an end, that requires an intellect, but rather is moved toward an end determined for it by another being. Now, the intelligent agent does not determine the end for itself either, unless it do so by considering the rational character of the good, for an object of the intellect is only motivating by virtue of the rational meaning of the good, which is the object of will. So the intellect determines the good of a thing and presents it to will, and will moves the person to act upon what intellect has presented as a good. I continue with Aquinas then. Therefore, every natural agent is neither moved nor does it move for the sake of an end, except insofar as the end is a good. Of course, the end is the purpose for which something acts, and so here Aquinas is identifying the end and the good. He goes on, for the end is determined for the natural agent by some appetite. Therefore, every agent acts for the sake of a good. So not only do they act for an end, but they act for the sake of a good as well. And he goes further then. We're now in Summa Contra Gentiles 3, chapter 16, and here he reiterates that the end of everything is a good. And then in 3:17 goes on to show that all is ordered to one end, which is God. But this was implicit already in what he had done in the previous two books and earlier in this passage, earlier in the Summa Contra Gentiles book 3. So here he writes the following. Order among ends is a consequence of order among agents. For just as the supreme agent moves all secondary agents, so must the ends of secondary agents be ordered to the end of the supreme agent, since whatever the supreme agent does, he does for the sake of his end. Now, the supreme agent does the actions of all inferior agents by moving them all to their actions, and consequently to their ends. Hence it follows that all the ends of secondary agents are ordered by the first agent to his own proper end. So this is what he has in mind here is God, and God is the primary agent. And God provides to all secondary agents the ends or purposes for which they exist, because God creates them with intention in God's own act of creating. But let's continue with the text of Aquinas. He goes on, of course, the first agent of all things is God, as we proved in Book 2. There is no other end for his will than his own goodness, which is himself, as we proved in Book 1. Therefore all things, whether made by him immediately or by means of secondary causes, are ordered to God as to their end. Now all things are of this kind, for as we proved in Book 2, there can be nothing that does not take its being from him, so all things are ordered to God as an end. So the foundation for his reasoning, as I said earlier, the foundation for his reasoning is what he's already established in Books 1 and 2. And so if we wish to scrap or argue with Aquinas about the way he's proceeding here, we need to go back and undermine the earlier discussions, perhaps show that he did not prove that God is a creator, or show that he did not prove that God is intellect, or show that he has not proven that God acts by will. But that means we have to go back to Books 1 and 2 if we're going to undermine the arguments here. Otherwise, it seems that quite a number of the arguments here just flow from what has already been established. His point in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 17, is to make it clear that God is the ultimate end of all things, and that God is able to act through intermediaries, which are intermediate goods, and yet all must return to God because God is the sole creator, and as such the determiner, by God's own intention, of the purposes, ends, and ultimate end of all things. I should make a note here as well and comment that what Aquinas is talking about in terms of primary and secondary causality, he has in mind here the liber de causas, or kalam fi macht acher, which we looked at earlier in this course, or discussed earlier in this course. At the end of Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 18, Aquinas spells out God's nature as agent and end, that is, as the real end for all things. Quote, moreover, the effect must tend toward the end in the same way that the agent works for the end. Now God, who is the first agent of all things, does not act in such a way that something is attained by his action, but in such a way that something is enriched by his action. So God doesn't do this for his own sake, but for the sake of other things. For he is not in potency to the possibility of obtaining something. Rather, he is in perfect act simply, and as a result, he is the source of enrichment. God can't receive anything because he's complete actuality. He has no receptivity as such. So things are not ordered to God as to an end for which something may be obtained, but rather so that they may attain himself from himself according to their measure, since he is their end. Summa Contra Gentiles 3:19 has one of the keys to this notion of God as end and as cause of all things, coming from God. That is, the key is that all things coming from God imitate God in a return to their cause. And this is the reditio. That is, they are images of God at various levels. Quote, created things are made like unto God by the fact that they attain to divine goodness. If then all things tend toward God as ultimate end, so that they may attain his goodness, it follows that the ultimate end of things is to become like God. Close quote. And second quotation, again, the agent is said to be the end of the effect because the effect tends to become like the agent. Hence, the form of the generator is the end of the generating action. But God is the end of things in such a way that he is also their first agent. Therefore, all things tend to become like God as to their ultimate end. So in some way, all things will be like God. Summa Contra Gentiles 3:20, all things imitate as well divine goodness, albeit on various levels according to their natures. So now he's talking about a hierarchy here of things of different kinds, different species. He writes then, quote, there is still another way in which goodness of a creature is defective in comparison with divine goodness. For as we said, God in his very act of being holds the highest perfection of goodness. On the other hand, a created thing does not possess its perfection in unity, but in many items. For what is unified in the highest instance is found to be manifold in lowest things. Consequently, God is said to be virtuous, wise, and operative with reference to the same thing. But creatures are so described with reference to a diversity of things. So creatures do not have the same unity as God has. And so, the more multiplicity the perfect goodness of any creature requires, it's required by the perfect goodness of the creature, the more removed it is from the first goodness, if it has more multiplicity with regard to its needs. If it cannot attain perfect goodness, it will keep imperfect goodness in a few items. He goes on, hence it is that, though the first and highest good is altogether simple, and the substances that are nearer to it in goodness are likewise close to it in regard to simplicity, we find some among the lowest substances to be simpler than some of their superiors, as is the case with elements in relation to animals and men. Yet these lower simple beings cannot achieve the perfection of knowledge and understanding which animals and men do attain. An interesting reference there to animals attaining perfection of knowledge and understanding. But let's go on. Summa Contra Gentiles 3:21. Things also imitate God by being causes of other things, just as God is, in a much more transcendent way, cause of all things. So another sign of imitation and likeness. Quote, things tend to the likeness of God in the same way that effects tend to the likeness of the agent, as we have shown. Therefore, things naturally tend to become like God by the fact that they are causes of others. Close quote. In Summa Contra Gentiles 3:25, Aquinas establishes the notion that the end for every intellectual substance is the understanding of God. He writes, quote, since all creatures, even those devoid of understanding, are ordered to God as ultimate end, all achieve this end to the extent that they participate somewhat in his likeness. Recall my discussion of reditio in the previous video and the notion of participation here. So all achieve this end to the extent that they participate somewhat in his likeness. Intellectual creatures attain to it in a more special way, that is, through their proper operation of understanding him. Hence, this must be the end of the intellectual creature, namely, to understand God. This would be the perfection, then, of an intellectual creature. Second quotation. The ultimate end of each thing is God, as we've shown. So each thing intends, as its ultimate end, to be united with God as closely as is possible for it. Now, a thing is more closely united with God by the fact that it attains his very substance in some manner. And this is accomplished when one knows something of the divine substance, rather than when one acquires some likeness of him. Therefore, an intellectual substance tends to divine knowledge as an ultimate end. So his argument is following very clearly. In Summa Contra Gentiles 3:25, then he faces the problem of the Arabic and Greek traditions, when he writes the following, quote, of course, someone could say that the ultimate end of an intellectual substance consists, in fact, in understanding the best intelligible object, not that the best object of understanding for this or that particular intellectual substance is absolutely the best intelligible object, but that the higher an intellectual substance is, the higher will its best object of understanding be. Let's pause here for a moment. So he's talking about the hierarchy of intellects, or hierarchy of angels in his theological talk here, and how one can know another. And Averroes and Avicenna has it that the lower comes to know what's immediately above it, and for Averroes in particular in his cosmology, it's through tasawwur bil aql, or intellectual conceptualization of what is above it, that the lower has its realization of itself and its nature as intellectual. but also recall that it isn't a matter of something being given by what's above, because in the context of Averroes, there is no efficient causality among immaterial entities. So let's go back to Aquinas then. He goes on, and so perhaps the highest created intellectual substance may have what is absolutely best as its best intelligible object. Pause here for a moment. This, according to Avicenna then, and Averroes, the created thing, the highest being immediately below God, has as its intelligible object what it seeks to know. It has what is immediately above it, and in this case it would be God. So Aquinas is thinking of that when he writes then, and so perhaps the highest created intellectual substance may have what is absolutely best as its best intelligible object. This is also found in the Liber de Causas text. And consequently, its felicity will consist in understanding God, but the felicity of any lower intellectual substance will lie in the understanding of some other lower intelligible object, which is, however, the highest thing understood by it. Particularly, it would seem true that of the human intellect that its function is not to understand absolutely the best intelligible object because of its weakness. Indeed, it stands in relation to the knowing of the greatest intelligible object, quote, as the owl's eye is to the sunlight, close quote. So in this case, what Aquinas is saying is that the lower things will not be able to attain to a vision of God. I mentioned this with regard to Avicenna when I said in Avicenna there is a return for human beings as intellectual or as rational souls. They are able to return to the level of the agent intellect. And so their return to their cause is a return to the agent intellect. But Aquinas is doing something very different. Remember, for Avicenna, there is mediate creation. For Aquinas, there is no mediate creation as such. But let's go on. This, of course, is the doctrine of Averroes and likely also that of Avicenna. But given Aquinas' notion of reditio and intentional creation of each and every particular entity and its end, given that, since God gives being to each, as well as his understanding of human beings as having immaterial intellectual souls, this comment by Aquinas is not at all surprising. He then next writes this. But it seems obvious that the end of any intellectual substance, even the lowest, is to understand God. So this is Aquinas' own doctrine. He says that seems to be obvious. It has been shown above that the ultimate end of all things to which they tend is God. Now pause. It was shown because God is an intentional agent and intentionally provides to all things their end, and so their end is to glorify God in the highest way that they are able to, and so that is in the reditio. We go on. Though it is the lowest in the order of intellectual substances, the human intellect is, nevertheless, superior to all things that lack understanding. And so, since there should not be a less noble end for a more noble substance, the end of the human intellect will be God himself, and human beings will attain that. He goes on, and an intelligent being attains his ultimate end by understanding him, as was indicated before. Therefore, the human intellect reaches God as its end through an act of understanding. So the reditio is the human being reaching God and understanding God. He says then, quote, now the ultimate end of man and of every intellectual substance is called felicity or happiness, because this is what every intellectual substance desires as an ultimate end, and for its own sake alone. Therefore, the ultimate happiness and felicity of every intellectual substance is to know God. And then, in Summa Contra Gentiles 3:26, this achievement of felicity, he says, involves an act of the will, since intellectual beings do not act by necessity of nature. but by willing. Since it is the intellect that proposes something as good to an intellectual being, and the pursuit of that good is made by will. Quote, things possessed of intellectual knowledge also have an appetite proportionate to this knowledge, that is, will. So will is appetite proportional to knowledge. So the will, he gives you a definition here. So the will is not peculiar to intellectual nature by virtue of being an appetite, but only insofar as it depends on intellect. However, the intellect in itself is peculiar to an intellectual nature. It specifically belongs to an intellectual nature. Therefore, happiness or felicity consists substantially and principally in an act of the intellect rather than in an act of the will. So primacy goes to the act of intellect here with regard to happiness and not to will. Because just willing does not bring about the fulfillment here of happiness. Rather, the fulfillment is found in the act of the intellect, in intellectually understanding God. In Summa Contra Gentilis 337, now we're going to look at 337 to 44. In 337, Aquinas establishes on the basis of what he did earlier to show that for human beings who are intellectual, the end of intellectual contemplation of the highest intelligible thing is ultimate felicity and happiness. And in this way, humans are like God and imitate God in the contemplation of truth by intellect. Again, he's bringing the likeness that he established earlier, the likeness of the effect to the cause. In Book 3, Chapter 36, he asserts that felicity does not consist in a general or generic conception of God vaguely held by human beings. Why? Because this would be imperfect, vastly imperfect. In fact, some of the generic notions would be such as just a person were to believe that there is somehow some ultimate goodness, and just vaguely leave it at that, not understanding its nature in any way, but just in a vague way, in a generic way, as Aquinas puts it. In 337, he goes on, nor does it consist in knowing God through demonstration. And I want us to pause here. I said, but wait. That is the conception of Averroes, knowing God through demonstration. Averroes himself, properly speaking. And for him, it makes sense, since for Averroes, since he has an entirely different notion of the human intellect. How does that work? Well, I'll leave that for discussion. Aquinas says, quote, but the aforesaid knowledge of God, which can be acquired through demonstration, does not do this, since even when we possess it, we still remain ignorant of many things. Therefore, such knowledge of God is not sufficient for human felicity. Close quote. But the knowledge of God that we have is a knowledge that is from demonstration quia, and also through negation. And so it doesn't fully give us an understanding of the nature or essence of God. And yet that is what the ultimate end consists in. So it's not just a matter of demonstration. But my own view of Averroes is that, in fact, the highest knowing that we can have is that in accordance with, I mentioned earlier, the Sharia or religious law of the philosophers, which is the highest kind of worship of God that is available to human beings, and that is the study and understanding of God and God's creation in the science of metaphysics. That is as far as ultimate human understanding of the cause of human beings can reach, because human beings are perishable individuals according to Averroes. But I continue with Aquinas here. Further, in 338, Aquinas writes that felicity does not consist in a general or generic conception of God vaguely held by human beings. 339, nor does it consist in knowing God through demonstration, which I'm repeating myself here, I see. And 3, chapter 40, nor does ultimate happiness or felicity consist in knowledge of God by faith. And we had discussed this earlier, so I won't go into it here. But that knowledge by faith is incomplete. It remains incomplete and intellectually incomplete and imperfect. In Book 3, Chapter 41, Aquinas considers at length the account of Ibn Bajjah, which we've already seen before in the in the commentary on the sentences, so I won't go through that again. Just recall his account of abstraction, Ibn Bajjah's account of abstraction, founded somehow on Plato's Republic, pardon me, Book 6, and its dialectic of ideas. In Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 42, Aquinas recounts the doctrine of Alexander, with reasoning based on the account of Alexander found in Averroes' long commentary on the De Anima. Averroes himself, of course, also critiques Alexander at length. In chapters 43 and 44, we find a lengthy account of Averroes, who, as I've already said, was misunderstood rather seriously by Aquinas, and that account also contains Aquinas' purported refutation of Averroes. Given the principles established by Aquinas, the refutation of Averroes is easy to establish for Aquinas. That is, if we were to say that what Aquinas has established is the proper interpretation of Averroes, which in fact it is not. So still, Aquinas' Averroes is only partially similar to Averroes himself on this particular issue. There's a completely different orientation from the account of the nature of being, the account of God as the first cause and creator, and that undermines the possibility of a direct comparison, even a direct refutation by Aquinas. Summa Contra Gentiles 351. Here, the issue is just how God is seen in his essence in this account, and as something we need to consider very carefully. So here I have what I think is a key paragraph in this section, and I want to go through this with you bit by bit. So A, this is Aquinas, so it is manifest that the divine essence may be related to the created intellect as an intelligible species by which it understands. But this does not apply to the essence of any other separate substance. All right, let's set the context here. It is by virtue of an intelligible species that we are able to understand the natures of things in the world. Our experience of things in the world, then, are subjected to abstraction by the agent intellect, and what it abstracts is an intelligible species, which is that by means of which the thing is understood. The intelligible species, or form, is a form in the human mind, which enables the understanding. Now, in the case of the divine essence would have to be in the human mind, enabling the understanding. He goes on then, B, yet it cannot be the form of another thing in its natural being. For the result of this would be that once joined to another thing, it would make up one nature. That is, if the divine essence is present in its full ontological reality in the human mind, in the human being, as form for the human being, in that sense, then, there would be no human being left. There would be the fullness of the divine there, and they would make up one nature, and the human being would be absorbed into the divine. C, this could not be, since the divine essence is in itself perfect in its own nature. And so there can't be any addition to the divine essence. It would make no sense. D, but an intelligible species united with an intellect does not make up another nature. So in our experience of intellectual understanding, we are able to noetically receive, not ontologically, but noetically receive something else into ourselves. And that doesn't make us another nature, but rather it perfects and fulfills our nature in natural human knowing. That's how it works there. So here, rather, it perfects the intellect for the act of understanding. And this is not incompatible with the perfection of the divine essence. So here, God is going to function when present to the human being. God is and in the human mind as an object of understanding, the divine essence is perfecting that. Summa Contra Gentiles 3:52, the vision of God transcends the natural powers of the human intellect. He writes, moreover, what exceeds the limitations of a nature cannot accrue to it except through the action of another being. So how can something accrue to us if it's above us? For instance, water does not tend upward unless it is moved by something else outside of it. Now, seeing God's substance transcends the limitations of every created nature. Indeed, it is proper for each created intellectual nature to understand according to the manner of its own substance, which is the lower manner. But divine substance cannot be understood in this way, as we showed above. Therefore, the attainment of a created intellect to the vision of the divine substance is not possible except through the action of God, who transcends all creatures. So how does this take place? God has to enhance the ability of the human intellect to receive, or any other intellect, to receive an understanding of the divine essence. Let's look closely at the following passage, which will complete this video presentation then. This is 353. He writes this: However, since we reach knowledge of intelligible things from sensible things, we also take over the names proper to sense knowledge for intellectual knowledge, especially the ones which apply to sight, which compared to other senses is more noble and more spiritual, and so more closely related to the intellect. We take over those ideas then. Thus it is that this intellectual knowledge is called vision. That's why it has the name vision. And since corporeal vision is not accomplished without light, those things whereby intellectual vision is perfected take on the name of light. He continues, hence even Aristotle in Book 3 of the De Anima likens the aged intellect to light, because of the fact that the aged intellect makes things actually intelligible, just as light, in a way, makes things actually visible. Therefore, this disposition whereby the created intellect is raised to the intellectual vision of divine substance is fittingly called the light of glory, not because it makes some object actually intelligible, as does the light of the ancient intellect, but because it makes the intellect actually powerful enough to understand. That is, it enhances it. Note that Aquinas had noted at the end of the previous paragraph, in 5, that, quote, an increase of the intellectual power by means of the acquisition of a new disposition must be accomplished in raising the created intellect to the vision of the divine. So let me wrap this up then with a final comment, and that is, now it's worthy of reflection to consider just how strong is the reasoning of Aquinas, and to consider how much of this follows from the foundational principles taken from reasoning found in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1 and Book 2. But I leave that for further classroom discussion, since I've already mentioned this issue earlier. And we'll stop here.